In the vast darkness of the galaxy, there is one rule that every species follows: fear the light. For the fragile aliens known as the Krell, a simple sunbeam is a death ray. 1 second of exposure to solar radiation turns their skin to ash. They build their cities in the shadows and hide behind thick metal shields, terrified of the stars. But the Krell are about to meet a creature that breaks all the rules. When the alarms on Shadowport 9 scream that the blast doors are opening, the alien crew prepares to see a melted corpse. Instead, they find Mark. The human isn't dying in the nuclear fire of the sun. He is wearing sunglasses, leaning back in a chair, and complaining that he forgot his sunscreen. To the galaxy, he is a biological monster. To humanity, he is just working on his tan. Shadowport 9 was the darkest place in the entire galaxy. It was a massive space station floating deep in the void, but it felt more like a tomb than a city. There were no windows in the hallways. Every corridor was wrapped in thick metal shutters. The lights inside the station were always dim, glowing with a faint, weak orange color. To a human, it was barely enough light to read a book. But to the aliens who built it, the station was a safe haven. These aliens were called the Krell. The Krell were a soft, fragile species. They were tall and very thin, with skin as pale as white paper. They had evolved on a rogue planet that had no sun, wandering in the eternal night of deep space. Because of this, they were terrified of light. To a Krell, a simple flashlight was a weapon. But their greatest fear was a star. They called solar radiation the burning death. They believed that the light of a sun was a laser beam designed to kill. If a Krell stepped into direct sunlight for just 10 seconds, their skin would blister and burn to ash. Mark was the only human on board Shadowport 9. He was a structural engineer sent from Earth to fix the docking bays. For Mark, the station was a nightmare. He had been there for 2 weeks, and he was incredibly bored. He felt like he was living inside a deep cave. His eyes strained in the constant darkness. He missed colors. He missed the blue sky. But most of all, he missed the heat. The station was kept freezing cold because the Krell overheated easily. Mark wore a heavy jacket everywhere he went, shivering while the aliens walked around comfortably. One afternoon, Mark couldn't take it anymore. He needed to feel something other than the cold, dark metal walls. He walked up to the main reception desk. The receptionist was a nervous Krell named Glip. Glip flinched when Mark approached because humans moved too fast and were too loud for the gentle aliens. Mark leaned against the dark counter and asked a simple question. He asked where the observation deck was located. Glip froze in horror. Her large, black eyes went wide. She whispered that the observation deck was a forbidden zone. It was sealed behind 3 layers of blast doors. She explained that the room faced the local star directly. It was a death trap. The radiation levels inside that room were high enough to melt a creature instantly. Glip warned him that going there was suicide. Mark just smiled. He didn't look scared, he looked excited. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a pair of black sunglasses. He told the trembling alien that he wasn't going to die. He told her he just needed a little vitamin D. Ignoring her panicked warnings, Mark turned around and walked down the long, dark hallway, heading straight toward the deadliest room on the station. Mark stood alone in front of the massive blast doors of the observation deck. The entrance was covered in terrifying warning signs. In the universal language of the galaxy, red lights flashed symbols that meant, "Do not enter," and "instant death." The Krell had locked this door over 100 years ago. To them, opening this door was like opening a hole in a submarine at the bottom of the ocean. But to Mark, the door was just an obstacle standing between him and a nice afternoon. He looked at the electronic control panel on the wall. It was protected by a complex code, but Mark was an engineer. He pulled out his datapad and connected it to the lock. Within minutes, the heavy locking mechanism clicked. The computer system issued a frantic audio warning. A robotic voice screamed, "Warning! Solar shielding is retracting. Lethal radiation imminent. Mark ignored the screaming computer. He pressed the final button. The thick metal shutters groaned loudly. Dust fell from the ceiling as the heavy gears began to turn. Slowly, the shutters slid apart. For the first time in a century, the darkness of Shadowport 9 was broken. A beam of intense, brilliant white light slammed into the room. The local star was a massive yellow sun, very similar to Earth's sun, but slightly brighter. The light flooded the observation deck, illuminating every corner. To a Krell, this light was a physical force that could peel paint off the walls. To Mark, it was heaven. The temperature in the room shot up instantly. Mark smiled as he felt the warmth hit his face. He walked right into the center of the light beam. He took off his heavy jacket and threw it into the corner. Then, he took off his shirt. He dragged a metal chair into the direct path of the sun, put on his sunglasses, and leaned back with his hands behind his head. He closed his eyes and let out a long, happy sigh. Suddenly, the silence was broken by the sound of heavy boots. The station's emergency alarms were blaring so loud they shook the floor. The blast doors behind Mark hissed open. A squad of Krell security soldiers rushed in. They looked like deep-sea divers. They were wearing massive, clumsy suits made of thick lead to protect them from the radiation. They moved slowly, terrified of the light. The lead captain looked ahead and gasped. Through the blinding glare, he saw the human sitting directly in the death ray. Mark wasn't moving. The captain screamed into his radio, his voice shaking with horror. He reported that the human was already dead, claiming that the radiation must have boiled his brain instantly. They prepared to retrieve what they thought was a melting corpse. The security team stood trembling in the shadows, just inches away from the bright square of light on the floor. They held long metal poles with hooks on the ends. Their plan was to drag Mark's body out of the fire, without stepping into the sunlight themselves. To the Krell soldiers, the sunbeam looked like a pool of boiling lava. The lead soldier sweated nervously inside his thick lead suit. He signaled his team to move forward. Just as a metal hook reached for Mark's foot, the human moved. He didn't scream in pain. He didn't dissolve into a puddle. He simply shifted his weight, scratched his nose, and let out a yawn. The soldiers froze instantly. They stopped breathing. A dead body was not supposed to move. Mark lifted his head and peered over the rim of his black sunglasses. He looked at the heavy, armored soldiers and frowned. He asked them calmly what they were doing with the sticks. The sound of his casual voice caused absolute panic in the room. The soldiers stumbled back, crashing into each other in their clumsy suits. They had expected a pile of ash, not a bored human asking questions. The squad leader raised his scientific scanner with a shaking hand. The device beeped frantically. The readings on the scanner were impossible. The radiation levels in the room were high enough to kill a Krell army in seconds. The scanner showed that Mark was being bombarded by high-energy UV particles. Yet, his biological signs were stable. His heart was beating slowly and steadily. He was not burning, he was actually absorbing the heat. The leader shouted that the machine must be broken because no biological creature could survive that exposure. Mark stood up and stretched his arms above his head. His skin had turned a slightly darker shade of pink. This terrified the aliens even more. They thought his skin was changing color because he was becoming radioactive. Mark tried to explain the situation to the terrified group. He told them that humans evolved on a dangerous planet next to a yellow star. He explained that his skin produced a special natural shield to block the light. He called it a tan. The aliens did not understand. They did not have natural shields. They only understood fear. To them, Mark was a monster who bathed in death rays for fun. The squad leader ordered his men to retreat immediately. They were too scared to arrest him. Instead, they ran out and sealed the thick blast doors remotely, locking Mark inside. They declared the observation deck a Class 10 hazard zone and pasted a warning sign on the door that read, "Beware of the solar demon." For 2 days, Mark remained locked inside the observation deck. To the alien crew, this room was a high-security prison cell. To Mark, it was a vacation spot. He had cleared a space on the floor and was enjoying the view of the star. However, the relaxing atmosphere changed instantly on the third morning. The giant yellow star outside suddenly erupted. A massive solar flare, a violent explosion of energy larger than a planet, burst from the surface of the sun. The wave of magnetic energy smashed into Shadowport 9 like a giant hammer. The entire space station groaned and tilted sideways. Coffee cups slid off tables, and delicate alien instruments exploded in sparks. On the command bridge, the situation was chaotic. The Krell officers were screaming as their computer screens turned red. The station's artificial gravity flickered on and off. The commander, a high-ranking alien named Zarl, held onto his chair to keep from falling. A terrified engineer shouted the worst news possible. The solar flare had overloaded the main power grid. The primary life shields, which protected the station from the deadly cosmic radiation, had failed. The failure was located deep inside the engineering sector. Without those shields, the invisible radiation from the flare began to leak into the ship. The engineering room became a death zone in seconds. The air inside that room was now thick with ultraviolet rays and X-rays. For a human, this level of radiation was dangerous and would cause sickness over time. But for the delicate Krell, it was instant poison. The commander ordered a repair team to go down, but the chief engineer refused. He explained that the radiation levels were too high. Even their thickest lead suits would only protect them for 2 minutes. That was not enough time to fix the generator. Furthermore, the manual reset lever was very small. The heavy gloves of the safety suits were too clumsy to grip the tiny handle. They tried to send remote-controlled robots to pull the lever. However, the magnetic storm from the solar flare fried the robots' circuits before they could even reach the door. The crew watched helplessly as the radiation levels on the bridge began to rise. They were trapped. Panic took over the crew. They huddled together in the dark, waiting for the end. Commander Zarl looked at the security monitors one last time. He saw the observation deck. While every Krell was crying in fear, Mark was standing at the window, watching the solar storm with fascination. He was eating a sandwich. He looked bored. Zarl realized with a shock that the solar demon was the only creature on board who could walk through the fire and live. The heavy lock on the observation deck clicked open with a loud thud. Mark stood up, surprised, as the voice of Commander Zarl came over the hidden speakers. The alien commander's voice was high-pitched and shaking with pure terror. He did not issue an order, instead, he begged. He explained that the station was dying and that Mark was the only creature strong enough to enter the engineering sector. Mark listened calmly, finishing the last bite of his sandwich. He wiped his hands on his pants and nodded at the security camera. To Mark, this wasn't a suicide mission, it was just a maintenance job. He picked up his heavy metal wrench and stepped out into the hallway. Mark walked through the station like a king walking through a panicked city. The hallways were bathed in flashing red emergency lights. Krell crew members ran past him, screaming and clutching their heads. When they saw Mark, they pressed themselves against the walls, terrified that his skin would burn them. Mark ignored them and marched straight toward the engineering sector. He reached the heavy bulkhead door that separated the safe zone from the radiation zone. A group of engineers stood there behind thick glass. They looked at Mark with wide, watery eyes. They watched him type the override code. The door hissed, and a blast of hot, dry air hit Mark in the face. Mark stepped inside the engineering room. The sensors on the wall were flashing lethal danger. To the Krell watching on the monitors, the room was filled with invisible fire. They expected Mark's skin to peel off immediately. But Mark just grunted and wiped sweat from his forehead. It was incredibly hot, feeling like the inside of a sauna or a desert at noon. The air shimmered with heat waves. The radiation from the solar flare was bouncing off every metal surface, but Mark's dense human bones and adaptive skin held strong. He felt a slight stinging sensation, like a mild sunburn starting to form, but he kept walking. He navigated through the maze of hot pipes and buzzing machines. Finally, he found the main generator. The manual reset lever was glowing faintly red from the heat. A Krell in a clumsy suit could never have grabbed it, but Mark had nimble fingers. He wrapped the hem of his shirt around his hand to protect it from the hot metal. With a grunt of effort, he grabbed the lever and yanked it down hard. A loud mechanical clank echoed through the room. Instantly, the hum of the cooling fans roared to life. The shields began to power up. Mark leaned against the machine, panting heavily and sweating, but very much alive. He looked up at the camera and gave a thumbs up. When Mark walked out of the heavy blast doors, the entire hallway went silent. The emergency lights had turned off, and the station was safe, but the crew looked at him with a mix of awe and terror. Mark looked terrible by human standards. His shirt was soaked in sweat, his hair was messy, and his skin had turned a bright, angry shade of red. To the Krell, who were pale and fragile, Mark looked like he was glowing with raw nuclear energy. They believed he had absorbed the fire of the sun into his body. The security team did not point their weapons at him this time. Instead, they bowed their heads, treating him like a dangerous ancient god who had decided to be merciful. Mark was immediately escorted to the medical bay by a team of doctors wearing full hazmat suits. The chief doctor was in a panic. He looked at Mark's red shoulders and screamed that the human skin was melting off. He prepared a laser scalpel to perform emergency surgery to remove the damaged tissue. Mark laughed loudly, which scared the doctor into dropping his scalpel. Mark explained that he didn't need surgery. He told them he just needed some cooling gel. After searching the station's chemistry lab, the aliens synthesized a simple bottle of aloe vera. They handled the bottle with trembling hands, believing it was a magical potion. When Mark applied the gel and sighed in relief, the doctors took notes, convinced they were witnessing a biological miracle. News of the event spread across the galaxy faster than light. The video footage of Mark sitting in the solar beam and walking through the radiation storm went viral. The Krell government, and many other species who feared the light, changed their laws immediately. Humans were no longer classified as dangerous predatory primates. Instead, they were given a new, honorable title, Solar Walkers. Every space station and mining ship wanted a human on their crew. Humans were the only ones who could fix external sensors, repair solar panels, or work in bright rooms without dying. What was a boring maintenance job for a human became the highest paid profession in the galaxy. 6 months later, Mark was back on Earth, enjoying a real vacation. He was lying on a sandy beach in Hawaii, wearing only shorts and sunglasses, soaking up the natural sun. His communicator beeped on his wrist. It was a priority message from Commander Zarl back at Shadowport 9. Mark opened the message, expecting a serious emergency. Instead, the commander's voice sounded shy and embarrassed. He begged Mark to return to the station for a special mission. He explained that the light bulb in the cafeteria had flickered and died, and the entire crew was too terrified to change it. Mark smiled, took a sip of his cold drink, and typed back a simple reply, "I'll be there on Monday. But I'm charging double."